First of all, we'd like to say thank you for joining us for this October UNconference. Today, we will be discussing digital securities or tokenized securities. And I am Valerie Dahiya, and I am joined by Lowell Ness. And I will start off by letting Lowell introduce himself, and then I will introduce mine.
Hey, everybody. So I am your typical corporate securities lawyer in Silicon Valley, focusing on emerging companies and venture capital, largely in the fintech space. I got started very early with the kind of Bitcoin craze when that first came out, as I've spent a lot of time kind of focusing on fintech generally. And that's I kind of got dragged kicking and screaming into this whole Bitcoin blockchain craziness over the last 4 or 5 years. Val, go for it.
All right, and I'm Valerie Dahiya. I'm a partner in our Washington, D.C. office, and I am a traditional securities regulatory attorney. I focus primarily on sales practices, trading practices, the rules and regulations that are applicable to broker-dealers, exchanges, clearing agencies, and transfer agents. And I spent a good majority of my career on the regulatory side, and now I represent broker-dealer clients and other clients that are looking to issue tokens and helping them assess what the securities risks are, and in the event they'd like to avoid being issuing securities, how to do so. So, Lowell, this has been kind of it feels like it's been a while, but it really hasn't. A lot of this stuff is really, it's as soon as it kind of hit the market, it exploded. So you've been doing this for quite some time. So do you want to go back and start kind of at the inception where we really started to see tokens being issued as securities, whether or not people thought they were securities or not? They were being issued, and walk us kind of to where we are currently and what we've seen as far as evolution.
Yeah, and when you start talking about digital securities, you really have to, I think, bifurcate initially between what we all think of as this kind of growing, strange animal of mutable securities, these utility tokens that might be a security under Howey based on facts and circumstances for a period of time until those facts and circumstances maybe change, and actual tokenized securities like shares of common stock and preferred stock that are just non-mutable. They'll always be securities. They represent a share of ownership. They represent a financial return native to the token or the share of stock that has been tokenized. And both of these things kind of got started at about the same time. I mean, the use cases for blockchain in general. I think Mark Andreessen was one of the first guys to put in a blog that you could digitize common stock and put a token out there that represents it. And one of the earliest projects was kind of this overstock sort of T0 project that got started trying to figure out how to do the tokenization of a traditional security. And at the same time, we had all these kind of utility tokens kind of growing up that that got closer and closer to farther and farther away from Bitcoin and into sort of a zone of now there are these efforts of others that people are counting on to drive value, and they're releasing tokens before the project is really even viable. And so I think we've got kind of this twin sort of new technologies coming up at the same time alongside each other. And now it's going to be an interesting question to see how these two things kind of play out. But we definitely are kind of hearing, and we're seeing some of the news about ATSs that that could be available. I'd love to hear your perspective on kind of what that process of an ATS like coming onto the scene is going to be like, and what that's going to open up for us, both on the digital security side and the kind of the digital asset side. The utility tokens that are securities while they're being traded under the right circumstances.
Right. Those are very interesting questions. And I think, when I think about where we are and where we've come from, I think about it on this large spectrum of, initially way back when you get a share of Disney stock and it would be pretty and it was manual and you'd put it in a safe. And then we went from manual to uncertificated, electronic, book entry form securities. And now we're seeing the digitization of security. So we've gone from manual to electronic. And now I think what we're seeing is the move from electronic to digitization. And and I think that starts probably with the ATS, with ATSs first, because to go public, you have to meet listing standards on the national securities exchanges. And to date, we haven't seen any that you can't meet listing standards in digital format. They have to be DTC eligible, be held in fungible bulk, have the master security held in street name at DTCC. So when you're thinking about how do ATSs fit within this larger market structure, it appears that it will make it easier for people who have issued securities pursuant to an exemption from registration. And those initial purchasers may want to trade on the secondary market. And there may be interested buyers in the secondary market. And an ATS may be a way to facilitate that liquidity on the secondary market. It comes with its own unique set of difficulties, however, because broker dealers to list a digital security on an ATS, even if they have the technology to transact digitally, they still have to comply with like Rule 15C211 and file the Form 211 with FINRA with all of the required information about the issuer, about the issuer's financials and so forth. So I think that, when it comes to, there's that, do issuers really want that secondary liquidity? If so, those initial purchasers, still you have to have an exception under the Securities Act to rely on to trade those in the secondary market and so forth. So it's not without some complications, but it definitely streamlines and provides potential liquidity for securities that were offered pursuant to an exemption.
Yeah, and I sort of think of it from a big picture standpoint as almost a stepping stone, maybe, to a fully public company status, where you have these private companies that have been, for one reason or another, reluctant to go public and to really get themselves into that full public company regulatory status. And I think the idea of having a little bit less liquidity for maybe a more streamlined process, as opposed to a big splashy IPO, may be something that actually gets us to a place where more of these private companies find themselves interested in liquidity and interested in finding exits other than M&A exits for their stockholders, and taking this initial step as a stepping stone towards kind of issuing their common stock and preferred stock in digital form, and having a slightly more efficient, slightly more liquid market than they would today with paper stock certificates and book entry. But you're right, the trend has been book entry for a long time, and the big thing that really changed was Delaware law has just changed to allow issuers, companies to keep their own books and records. And so when you're doing a digital security, one of the things you got to do is have the board basically designate the blockchain that you're trading those securities on as its books and records. And that's a sort of an interesting concept, but that's what Delaware law now permits. And so it's something that I think we can see all kinds of opportunities for these sort of true traditional securities to kind of, as the chairman of the SEC recently was sort of musing, I think publicly, we could see this trend develop toward a true digitization of all of the capital markets, because the blockchain thing it's a definitely more efficient settlement process. Mm-hmm. And that clearance and settlement stuff is a really big part of the current kind of state of the art. And so having a technology that streamlines that is just, you know, everything's easier. You know, when you think about transfer agents, you know, querying the blockchain, you know, kind of in an automated way to figure out who the record holders are. You know, there's so many opportunities to just, you know, tiny little bits here and there, but when it all kind of adds up, it's going to be a way more efficient system that feels like the wave of the future that we're going to start to see. So,
Right.
yeah.
Well, one of the things that, so over the past, let's say, probably 2 decades, but when you look especially at the last decade, this is a point that you hit on, is that far fewer companies are going public. And a significant barrier to going public is the cost associated with going public. And so do you think that the blockchain and being able to use distributed ledger technology will significantly reduce the cost associated with going public, with a lot of the different, you know, with right now we have all of these intermediaries that are involved, from, you know, your outside counsels to the exchanges and their listing standards, to the investment bankers and the accountants. I mean, like, you have a whole panoply of different disciplines and experts involved in a company going public. And just, do you think that this will affect the cost associated with companies going public?
I think a little, but I think one of the biggest costs is really focus and management focus and attention, and I think that's the perception really in Silicon Valley, is that I just want to put my head down and build my product, and you know, I don't need any liquidity today. I'm just going to keep building towards a future. There's more of a long-term mindset of building, and getting distracted by quarterly earnings is not something people want. I think that's maybe the more significant so sort of cost that people perceive to being a public company, is that just time and attention cost. But and I think that could potentially be a little bit easier in a sort of a public company light scenario, where they're, you know, private but trading on an ATS with you know, more limited disclosure and just a lot less pressure maybe from all those traditional kind of players in the capital markets, who are looking for earnings calls, looking for guidance, looking for, you know,
The reporting, the ongoing reporting obligations and
yeah,
the cost and time associated with it, with being a reporting company.
yeah, and they're going to have to provide some level of disclosure for sure in order to enable secondary trading on ATSs as private companies. And that's, you know, that's kind of what SharesPost and Second Market and others, you know, kind of did for the world, as really honestly, as Facebook got to become this private company that had a real brand, a household name brand, that suddenly kind of sparked interest in retail as a private company. You know, you saw those kind of companies trying to figure it out and trying to come up with a way to trade secondary restricted shares. And, you know, a disclosure requirement is inevitable when you're talking about trading securities, but maybe it can be a little bit less than, and on all that focus and time and attention is a little bit easier if the disclosure is a little bit more perfunctory and there's just not quite the same level of you know, spotlight maybe from and attention from all of these other players that look to national market listed securities as a different animal. And I think, you know, somebody listed on an ATS is it's a little bit more liquidity, but maybe it's just a lot less time and attention.
Right, right. And I think about, you think, like, when you're thinking about like the NASDAQ private markets of the world, you're thinking about, I think of course of OTC markets, which is probably the largest over the counter market. And that deals in, when you're dealing with both privately held and, you know, registered but not listed stock, and all that goes along with trading in those. So I definitely, I agree with you. I think that there will be more pressure to digitize securities. It's interesting to me because sometimes I wonder if the pressure is going to come primarily from the issuers because of the perceived cost and efficiencies that they feel can be leveraged, or if it will come from the industry, from the securities industry and all of the intermediaries, and also from perceived cost or efficiencies that they believe can be had by leveraging the technology. Do you have a view one way or the
Well,
other?
I think, yeah, it's back to that original point about there's this dual sort of track happening here, and I'm not sure which is gonna really, because I think there's a possibility that those utility tokens, that need to essentially exist as a security for a period of time while network adoption is being sort of undertaken, and those efforts are kind of being, expended to create value. You're going to have to treat it as a security, and people are going to want, and it's probably longer than people thought. Certainly the 2017 vintage thought it was, you could transition into non-security status kind of overnight. And now we're starting to, I think, with Blockstack and others coming out and filing Reg A pluses and spending years in sort of security status before moving to non-security status. I think that dynamic could well be a driver toward these ATSs, and wanting to have those, that 1 or 2 year period or whatever it may be. We don't know actually how long it might be, but that interim period while network adoption is kind of happening for a particular token, that could end up being a significant driver toward this middle ground ATS, some liquidity, some disclosure obligations, kind of stepping stone status for public companies. But it could also turn out to be the case that VCs and others decide that they want their private companies to go tokenize and start to add some liquidity into their cap table at an earlier stage. And we've dealt with this concept of early liquidity for many years, and usually it's pretty targeted to the founders. And this would be a way of creating a little bit more liquidity for not just the founders, but the rest of the team, which drives a lot of interesting ideas for startup companies who, compete for talent. And so having the ability to compete with a slightly more liquid private security could wind up being the real driver toward these ATSs as well. So it could come from either of those, I think, dynamics that we're seeing in the marketplace these days.
Right. I also think about it from whether or not there will be interest from a regulatory perspective. And, I know that regulators are looking at some of the potential efficiencies that can be leveraged and created from the use of the technology. So it kind of seems like once you bring together all of those pieces of the puzzle, as you were just saying, that at some point we will reach that tipping point, and we're going to see the speed at which mass adoption will happen. Once all those pieces come together, I think it will be almost in the blink of an eye, because we know we represent enough clients and we have enough conversations to know that so many different constituents within the capital markets are looking at how to leverage the technology, and working together, oftentimes with one another.
Well, where would you say we are on this sort of this future vision of having a truly cleared ATS that could trade digital securities? And there's a number that are, kind of close or claiming to be close, that and a number that are doing it. But I mean, at what point do you think we're going to get to a place where it's just, I can pick up the phone and call 5 ATSs and get listed on 2 of them? Like when does this kick in, and where are we, in that regulatory sort of arc?
I still feel like we're somewhat at the beginning of that regulatory arc, because I think one of the key issues is still custody. Broker dealers still don't have the ability, generally speaking, to custody digital assets. What does a good control location look like, and how is that solved for? So I think that's one of the issues. However, if it's a bilaterally settled transaction, then you don't have to deal with the custody component. And I think that, the no action position that the SEC just provided in the past couple of weeks with regards to the ATSs, you can see that within less than a year, the staff came back and was willing to amend its position to facilitate the trading of digital securities on ATSs. So while I still think we're very much at the beginning, I think that you're seeing pressure being placed on, on different pressure. There are different pressure points, and I think that you can see the easing. And I believe it's still going to be incremental at this point, because one, do we have enough digital securities to really trade and provide enough interest for investors to really be clamoring for it? So that's one thing. You've got to have the issuers that are issuing digital securities and issuers that, investors are interested in, right? So I think that that's where it kind of, all of those pieces have to come together. But I think that, Lowell, in the next year to 3 years, we're going to see really substantive forward momentum. And I think as it picks up, it's going to be really fast. It's going to be like it's going to evolve really quickly. But I kind of still feel like we're at the beginning, don't you?
I mean, it always takes longer than you think. I mean, that's the thing, is for sure. I mean, everything is way more complicated than you realize when you get under the hood and you start tinkering with moving parts of this very finely tuned machine. And it does take longer. The idea is a good one. Everybody gets the sense of it. It feels like, we've all kind of figured out that this is kind of coming, it's happening, and we're working on it. But yeah, I get the point. It's just going to take us some time. But I did like seeing that no action letter that FINRA had gotten through on the bilateral piece. At least that's clearly it's happening.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was, it was pressure from the industry, from their membership. So that tells you a lot, that there's a lot going on behind the scenes.
Yeah.
So it looks like we've reached our 20-minute point. So we just want to reiterate that we appreciate everyone tuning in for this webinar. It's been great talking with Lowell. He has a substantial amount of experience in this space. So thanks, Lowell, for joining me.
Well, I'm glad to have the real lawyers on my team. Thanks, Val.
All right.